Thank you so much. All those praisings are very touching, but the other day when we arrived in Edmonton, came to me this young student girl, lovely girl, and told me, you look so much older in life than in the poster. So, you know, all the other compliments are worth nothing. That's a reason to make all the way from Tel Aviv to Edmonton. My book's name is The Punishment of Gaza. I think the punishment of Gideon Levy is to bring me here 5 hours ago to this most amazing city and to tell me to leave tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning. Really, but maybe the Israelis deserve such a punishment. But really, the group of young people that I met here in the last few hours, let me tell you, I'm so deeply moved and impressed by the level of knowledge, really, I'm still almost speechless, and by the beauty of the city. You are really, really lucky to live in this city. And to spend even one evening away from this wonderful landscape in a hall in a university dealing with the Israeli occupation is really a sacrifice, which I wouldn't have taken. Would it be my choice? I think that such an evening could not have taken place in Israel, because, and here again and again after this cross-country tour, I can tell you I'm amazed again and again by the level of curiosity and involvement and knowledge of people who are really willing to know, willing to listen, willing to be active. And such an evening, as I said, cannot take place in Tel Aviv, because Tel Aviv has no interest in the Israeli occupation, and I'll get to it very soon. Because it's my last evening in Canada, I would like to take this opportunity to thank from the depths of my heart to Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East for initiating this tour. I knew quite little about this organization before I came here. I'm so deeply impressed after 1 week, and above all, I would like to really thank Grace, who had to suffer listening to me evening after evening, repeating the same jokes evening after evening, trying to say the same things evening after evening. So I'm really grateful, Grace, for this wonderful week we had together, unforgettable week. Having said all this, we have also to speak about reality. As Grace mentioned, I was born in Tel Aviv. I was brought up in Tel Aviv. I'm a typical product of the Israeli education system. You by now know even my dark sides, namely serving in the Israeli army, and what is much worse than this, working for Shimon Peres for 4 years. But this is behind me, and nobody is perfect. I'm mentioning this because I was really a good boy, Tel Aviv, until back in the 80s, almost by accident, I started to travel to the occupied territories. I came there really without any, quite brainwashed, like any Israeli. I was 14 when the 67 war took place. I still remember the first trip to the occupied territories with my parents. I had a girlfriend then, my first girlfriend, and her father was a colonel, so we got a permission to go immediately 2-3 days after the war was over. And I was so deeply moved to be in the Rachel tomb, and so deeply moved to be in Hebron and all those holy places. I can't recall, I don't remember I saw one Palestinian there. And this is so typical. I didn't see them. And for many years I didn't see them. And until today, the Israelis don't see them. But back in the 80s, I, by chance, started to go under a professional mission to the occupied territories gradually. And then I realized after a few months of traveling there, a few things that made me decide that I'm going to dedicate my professional career to document the Israeli occupation. Many times people say that I'm writing about the Palestinians. It's not true. I write about us, Israelis, and what is being done on our behalf, what the sons of our friends and the friends of our sons are doing. And I'm trying to prevent this situation which the Israelis can live so much in peace with what's going on. So I realized back in the 80s that the biggest drama of Israel is taking place in its backyard. I realized that there is almost no one to tell the story. I realized that there is hardly anyone who wants to hear the story. Many times I say that almost all my journalistic projects, I'm always exclusive, which is the wet dream of any journalist to be exclusive. I wish I would have been less exclusive, but in most of my stories, I am exclusive. So it was then, in the late 80s, when I decided that this is going to be my career, my professional mission to document the Israeli occupation. Now, as you all know, there were many occupations in history. Some of them were longer than the Israeli occupation. Others were more brutal and cruel than the Israeli occupation. But I cannot recall one occupation in which the occupier feels so good about himself, and for sure I can't know, maybe there are some historians here who would correct me, I can't tell about any occupation in which the occupier presented himself as the victim. Or if you want to put it in the unforgettable words of the late Prime Minister Golda Meir, the only man in her cabinet, as she was called then, she said, this lovely lady, we will never forgive the Arabs for forcing us to kill their children. And this way of thinking, which is so typical, we the victims, the only victims, the ultimate victims, continue with this occupation, and what is so amazing that we feel so good about ourselves. Israel, quite a liberal and open-minded society, quite a democracy. Many Israelis, people with values, were brought up with norms and values. Many Israelis consider themselves as caring about moral questions. Israel, the state who will always send the first rescue mission to any disaster in the world, will it be floods in the Philippines or earthquake in Turkey, first field hospital in Haiti, always they will be the first one. Any average Israeli, young Israeli would help an old lady to cross the road, many times even if she doesn't want to cross the road. People with values. Part of you know or met some Israelis, really not monsters. And I was asking myself for so many years, how come? How come that those people are responsible for those atrocities? How come that those people don't even ask any moral questions whatsoever? How come that Israel is still perceived in this country and in many others as the only democracy in the Middle East, when the facade is really very democratic for its Jewish citizens? But there are two more communities living in Israel. And you know, the occupation is part and parcel of Israel. Nobody can claim anymore that it is something temporary, that it's about to end. Because Israel finally had existed only 19 years without the occupation. So nobody can claim that this is not part of Israel. The occupation is part of Israel. And in this only democracy in the Middle East, there are two other communities rather than the Jewish community. One is what we like to call the Israeli Arabs, not to mention that they are Palestinians, and they have full civil rights, but deeply discriminated. I will not get to it now. And the other community is obviously the 3.5 million Palestinians living under the Israeli occupation. You can't separate between these three communities. They are all part and parcel of Israel. And to claim that this is a democracy is really to mislead, because you can't ignore the fact that in the backyard this is happening. Part of us might know already by now that it's almost impossible to be half pregnant. Either you are pregnant or you are not pregnant. I want to claim that you can't be half democratic. You can't be a democracy only to one community and not to all the others. This is not democracy. So it took me some years to ask myself, how come that we feel so good about ourselves? Any average Israeli, I can assure you, take my word, is deeply convinced that the IDF, the Israeli army, is the most moral army in the world. Many times I try to claim maybe we are the second moral army in the world. You know, maybe the army of Luxembourg is more moral and we are the second one. Israelis will be deeply offended if you tell them this. How can you dare? Second moral, we? And that's a very deep conviction. So feeling so good about themselves, while all this is happening, must have an explanation. And lasting for so many years, without any moral doubts, must have any kind of explanation. And you know, I found the explanation by chance. It was one of those days when I was standing many years ago in the Kalandia checkpoint, which is separates between Jerusalem and Ramallah. In the old days, today it looks different. And instead of looking at the people, I looked at the environment. And I saw the environment. It was really depressing. Garbage, hundreds of people waiting in the sun or in the rain without any protection, no toilets, no water, nothing. And it was then when I really came to the conclusion, or had this revelation, that it's not about the Palestinians, it's about the Israeli soldiers. We do anything possible to prevent them of feeling that they are confronting human beings. Because then they might have some doubts, then they might ask questions. But if you give them the feeling that they are not confronting human beings who need, for example, a toilet, then it's much easier. I remember once I wrote that we treat the Palestinians in the checkpoints like animals, and I got so many protest letters from animal rights organizations, very rightly so.